teaching for now. I'm at NYU for 18 years. I kind of got, Fred was asking me earlier how I got interested in energy, and it really was as a result of living in Kazakhstan. I had an opportunity when I was in graduate school to do a what was then called a National Security Graduate Enhancement Fellowship that brought me to Kazakhstan and back to Russia to do area and language studies. And while I was living in Kazakhstan, this was in the mid to late 90s, I had kind of the opportunity to see a country rich in natural resources and a lot of interest on the part of private companies, Chevron, Total, Exxon and Mobil, now it's Exxon Mobil, you know, kind of get involved and look for opportunities in Kazakhstan, and got to really understand also the relationship between Kazakhstan and the rest of the Central Asian region. And I had studied, I was telling Fred, I aged myself earlier, but when I was an undergrad, I did Soviet economics and Soviet politics because the Soviet Union was still as one. So I've been teaching the geopolitics of energy now for 18 years. Originally, I called it the geopolitics of oil. So when I was teaching it from 2005 till about 2012, it was the geopolitics of oil. And then after 2012, I renamed it the geopolitics of energy because it wasn't just about oil, it was also about gas. It was about, you know, in terms of looking at renewable energy, nuclear energy. So I've been kind of immersed in this world. So the two classes that I teach now are kind of on every fall I teach energy, environment, resource security, and every spring I teach the geopolitics of energy. And I sometimes also do climate security. So this is kind of my space. I find it to be always interesting. I think there's so much happening in the energy world, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk to all of you tonight. I'll base part of my comments on the piece that I wrote for the Great Decisions, but I also have to say that I wrote that piece over the summer. So it was the summer of 2022 when I was preparing it. I sent it to Great Decisions early in the fall, and now it's, you know, March 2023. And so even between the summer of 2022 and today, we've seen a lot of changes. And of course, many of those changes are the result of Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine. I always say re-invasion. I emphasize re-invasion because sometimes we forget, you know, 2014 and Russia going in and annexing Crimea at that point. So, but before I get started, I'd love to just, I'm a teacher. I was teaching the geopolitics of energy earlier this afternoon. I'd love to just get a sense in terms of some of the questions or thoughts that you all have. Feel free to kind of raise your hand, and then I'll try to kind of weave those into my comments. But what brought you out on a Tuesday night to come to listen to someone talk about energy and the relationships between countries and how they relate to geopolitics? Anyone want to volunteer?
Well, you were kind of interested in the future demand for oil, and you know, is gas a substitute? Natural gas is a substitute for oil, and the renewables I think are very slow to grow, but they are coming. But the nuclear is probably the best hope. So the question I would love to hear you answer is, you know, what do you see as the future of oil? Is it peak? The usage peak?
I would say no.
But it's because we have so many other areas in the world that need energy. And it is still expanding India, China.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. It's a great question.
I'd love to hear your views on your thoughts of the ability of natural gas to replace oil, or where you see the future of oil.
Okay, excellent. I'll definitely make sure that those questions get answered. Super interesting.
Similar question about natural gas, but I'm more interested in LNG and the position of the United States as an exporter of LNG and how that would roil some of the established markets. And I'm also interested in your thoughts about a rebirth of nuclear, which probably is the easiest stopgap to get from carbon to something else.
Great. I wish I could. I probably have 2 presentations that I could open up, because today I had someone from Potent and Partners, a senior consultant who works in the shipping LNG space, and gave a kind of a real tremendous look into what's happened in the last year in the liquefied natural gas space, and talked to my students. And so I have lots of thoughts on that. Nuclear is I had a couple slides today that I presented to students, so I'm happy to give you these. Again, I place myself in that there I could bring 20 different people who work in the energy space who would have different perspectives. So when I talk about what my sort of thoughts are on peak oil demand, I could bring 5 people who would 100% disagree with me and would tell me why I'm wrong. So as long as we sort of set that as, you know, kind of as an understanding.
Yeah, in the spirit of what you just said, as many analysts as you find that many different perspectives. But from your perspective, what are you seeing, and you can get into it, how are companies and governments allocating resources and capital in a balance between protecting fossil fuels and controlling and around the security around that versus trying to be at the forefront of the renewable movement? You know, how do you balance and how do you allocate capital and resources? How much of that is government? How much of that is venture markets and capital markets?
Great. Lots of good questions. Okay, I'm gonna have to come back to all of you to like remind me to make sure that I've answered them.
I'm a geographer.
Okay.
That's something I'm into, and lately I've been following Volt's podcast, energy and land.
Okay. And what area are you most interested in?
Probably more climate change related.
Okay. Excellent. I'll definitely, yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this is connected, of course, you know, and I think there is this emphasis sort of pre-2022 and kind of a pivot a little bit as we look at 2023 and beyond, because of a new emphasis on energy security and the importance of energy security that has some ways not sort of taken some of the importance off of climate change, but I think there maybe is sort of how to find that balance. I think that's something that we're seeing. I think there was another hand here.
In the theme of history repeating itself, do we see China in a couple of years being in the same position that Japan was put in terms of the growing economy, not being able to control access to vital natural resources, and then looking at, you know, a new greater coast prosperity sphere as they go into the South China Sea with the Philippines and the others, because they don't have their own oil as well as other stuff they have.
China? Yeah, they have some. They don't have. Yeah, they're the largest importer. They're the largest importer. That is important, but they have a lot of other materials, minerals, metals that they have majority control of in the like international sort of system, which is interesting, which I'm going to show you a map actually. And did you have your hand up?
No, I think Waste was given my concern about China and its role. I'm hearing more drums. I'm trying to figure out how China fits into this subject.
Very much fits into the subject. Just the most recent 20th Party Congress, security was mentioned 91 times. Okay, so security, energy security, I think is that. I'm gonna not, because this is, I'm going to sort of show you a slide here that, so we're gonna start with this slide. So I think it's really important when we sort of think about the geopolitics of energy and we think about sort of what today's energy system looks like. And so if you were my students at NYU and this was our first class, I'd give you a quiz, right? I would say how many millions, I'm saying millions, how many barrels of oil does the world use in any given day?
100 million.
Oh, such a smart group. Yeah, so we have about, so I'm not even gonna about 100 million barrels a day. So the world consumes approximately 100 million barrels a day, give or take 1%, 1.2% year-on-year growth is kind of what is expected. Of course, you know, COVID was shifted things downwards. So we saw a pretty steep reduction in global oil demand. But, you know, when many countries in the world are on lockdown and people are not traveling, as much as they are, but now we're back to revenge tourism. You know, we're back to what I heard, which I loved, is YOLA. Does anyone know what YOLA means? You only live once. Yeah, but it was used in the context of what we might see in terms of from China and sort of China's energy demand, specifically around oil. Because as China sort of opens up and there's more opportunities to travel again, that you only live once, how that's going to be reflected in China's oil demand. Did you have your hand up? I want to make sure that I
just wanted a little context. When you say paying like barrels of oil, what exactly do you mean by that? Like how much per barrel are we consuming?
Well, there's 36 gallons of oil in a barrel, right? And so a lot of it depends on where you're looking at where oil is used. In the United States, the majority of it is used in transportation, but you're using petroleum. I mean, there's also liquid petroleums. I don't want to get into all the technical details, but we use, you know, in the United States, most of it is used in the transportation space, but also petrochemicals, fertilizers. We don't use, in the United States, we generally don't use a lot of oil in our heating, but in other parts of the world, it will be used in heating. And so, but approximately 100 million barrels a day, the United States is the largest consumer of oil, but which country is the largest importer of oil? China. So China is the largest importer of oil. We used to be the largest importer of oil until when?
Oil.
Yeah, up until, so you kind of see this around 2014, 2015, that the United States is no longer the largest importer because now we are producing, we are now, in terms of production, it's the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, the three largest producers. Each of these three countries produces upwards of 10 plus million barrels a day. Russia producing, you know, February 2022, producing about 10.3, 10.4, hit about 10.7. Now you're seeing a hit on production. Saudi Arabia producing a little over 10. Always interesting questions about Saudi Arabia. How high can they go? How much can they increase their production? You know, maybe 13. Could they consistently produce at 13? That's a question mark. I mean, the United States we're a really big producer. So we're producing over 11 million barrels a day, and you know, potentially can go up to 12. We were around 12 and a half before COVID hit. And then, you know, natural gas is also very interesting. You know, you have the United States, Russia, and Iran, but what's important here is this is dry gas. This is dry natural gas. We're not talking about liquefied natural gas. If it was liquefied natural gas, it's United States and Qatar are right now neck and neck with LNG exports, which is extraordinary. I want everyone to stop and consider this, that if I had shown you this in 2008, United States would not be here. I mean, what's super interesting is those of you that follow natural gas, Cheniere, which is Cheniere was actually building an import terminal for liquefied natural gas because the United States had peaked. We were going to be a taker of liquefied natural gas. And now, you know, now we are, you know, the world's largest producer of natural gas. And I think what we have seen in the last year, there was a question about the role of LNG, and what I heard today from Potent & Partners, which I think is an interesting story, is how US LNG really came into the market to help replace Russian gas. So liquefied natural gas that was brought into the European market was able to displace a portion, not all, but a portion of the Russian piped gas. And something that's super interesting also, because I think we think oftentimes that, especially here, like the building of energy infrastructure is slow, really takes a long time. In under a year, Germany, and it's still, they don't yet have 6, but they have 4 FSRUs. So these are sort of like floating terminals that they can take, import it, that they can import LNG into and regasify it. Pretty extraordinary that they could contract that out, long-term leases, but now is again, and is provided an opportunity to reduce its very heavy dependence that it had on Russia. So over 60% of Germany's gas came from Russia. So there was, Europe was 40% in kind of as collectively, so very high dependency. I'm not going to kind of go into, but if you look over here at consumption, again, it's the United States, it's China, and it's India. These are we're the largest consumers. Refining, midstream, that goes into more of the technical. This is kind of the story that is emerging in the kind of, if you think about the International Energy Agency, the term that they said should be the term of 2021, critical minerals. Okay, so critical minerals, we oftentimes don't really think too much about, but if you're looking at any of the renewable energy technologies that are sort of part of what is referred to as the energy transition, they require critical minerals. And so these clean technologies that are really important. So these are the minerals, and copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, the platinum group metals, but then you have the mining, so where you're extracting them from, you have the processing, then you have the battery materials, you have the polysilicon that goes into solar panels, wind turbines and components, electrolyzer manufacturing, EV deployment, PV installation, wind installation, electrolyzer installation. So this is, when you're thinking about today's energy system, it's a very mixed portfolio of different types of energies, right? There's not, so we're talking about oil, we're talking about natural gas, we're talking about renewable energies, we're talking about biofuels, we're also thinking about hydro, someone mentioned nuclear. So these are all different energy sources that are sort of part of the energy mix, and depending on where you are in the world, you will see what that mix looks like. Even across in the United States is super interesting because depending on which state you're in, you'll have a different mix. So if you go to Kentucky, you're going to see a lot more heavier reliance on coal than, for example, if you're in New York or New Jersey. New York and New Jersey, don't use coal for in the electricity system and the power system.
It's electrolyzer.
That also goes into sort of renewable energy sort of technologies. Yeah, so kind of considered to be very important. China is so one of the big takeaways here that you should, I think, take note of is that when you're thinking about hydrocarbons, so oil and natural gas, the United States plays a very significant role across the upstream and the sort of the refining midstream side of the picture. But when you're getting into renewable energy technologies and the critical inputs, and I know you talked about, Fred, you had someone in talking about supply chains. So this is where I think the picture looks a little bit different, because then you're looking at, so for example, copper, it's Chile, it's lithium, Australia, Indonesia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, rare earths, China. But then when you go into processing, It's all China. So China processes almost about 85% of all of the minerals and most of the metals. And then when you go into battery materials, again, polysilicon, maybe some of you are sort of followed some of the investigations into polysilicon, because some of this polysilicon comes out of the Xinjiang region of China. Xinjiang is where Uyghurs, and this is so when you the Uyghur camps. So there's been heavy tariffs and some sanctions against polysilicon that comes from the Xinjiang region, which has hit the U.S. solar market. So you see wind turbine and its components, and then PV installations, wind installations. Now this is the installation side. So this is the deployment of solar, the deployment of wind, and then EV deployment. You know, China has a massive push towards EVs. They're doing it through basically their own industrial policies to build out EV production. The United States, the European Union, both of which have, European Union has lots of incentives. They have targets to ban the internal combustion engine, similar to what we see in California. I think California is 2040. Norway is, I think, 2035. Some countries in the European Union are like within the next 10 years, there's meant to be a ban on the internal combustion engine, meaning that all new cars sold would have to be electric vehicles. So I share this with you because this is sort of shows you the complexity. In fact, if you look at liquefied natural gas, if you looked at a map from 1980, you would see about 3 or 4 countries that were producers and 5 countries that were buyers of liquefied natural gas. Today, they call it like it's a bowl of spaghetti, because you have more countries that are takers of liquefied natural gas, and you have more countries that are producing, but you would still, I think, see that when you think about supply, there's not an abundant amount of gas that is, so pretty much, and I think maybe to sort of talk about supply, and this is where I think what we've seen in the last year is very interesting, is we are seeing a market that is a very tight market. So when you're thinking about if we just take oil, okay, now you identified that about approximately 100 million barrels of oil a day are consumed. There's not a lot of excess oil being produced. So we're pretty much kind of at that point of we're meeting. That's why, what did you experience over the summer? Does anyone remember? Or do you not want to remember how much you paid? Right. So over the summer, there was because of what we were seeing in Russia, because of sort of self-sanctioning on the parts of, so you started to sort of see a tightening of supply. You also had OPEC and OPEC Plus not wanting to sort of respond to tight supply with an increase in production. So they've been sort of playing their cards to say, you know what, we don't really want to add a lot of extra oil to the market. We're kind of happy with higher prices. We'd like to kind of keep prices in that there's a sweet spot. I think that it's really important to remember that there's kind of a sweet spot for the price of oil. So if you're Saudi Arabia, you like 85, 90. You don't really like 100, 110. I'm going to ask you why. Why do you think a country like Saudi Arabia, which, 60, almost 70% probably, if there are bankers in the room, you can correct me, but probably about 70, 75% of its budget comes through oil revenues. So you would think the higher, the better. But why might Saudi Arabia not want to see $110, $115, $120 barrel oil?
It's going to incent higher cost producers outside of that country to crank up production and compete with it.
Yes, which is kind of an interesting part of that, that story that, you know, Saudi Arabia wanting to sort of punish the United States, right? And not wanting the United States to gain too much market share because of its shale production. And if it increases its production, there's that, not wanting to give other producers more money, more market, absolutely, and or incentivize more production.
Because it'll have a detrimental effect on their economies. If the economies slow down, their usage will go down.
Okay, detrimental effect on their economies. Okay, but how?
Oh, I was going to say that it starts to further incent replacement.
Yeah. So as soon as what happens here? What happens in the United States when you start to get demand destruction? You start to say, I don't want to pay $5.50 to fill up my car. It's also, you know, this past summer, you know, if you were following some Twitter people, but people who would, you know, who are very pro EVs, they were like, look at you, you're paying $5.50 a gallon. I'm charging my EV and it's costing very little. I can do it for $100 a month, part of my electricity bill. And look, how much does it cost to fill up a regular ICE vehicle? It's $60, $70 maybe to fill a tank. So that high price can incentivize replacement or incentivize movement towards EVs, movement towards, I'm going to take you back in time, because I think this is a very, very important moment in the United States. And I know sometimes people have bad memories of thinking about elections because we constantly. So can anyone remember or want to kind of go back to 2008? The election of 2008 in the United States. What?
There were pipeline issues.
There were pipeline issues. Okay, good. So who were the two candidates in 2008? Obama and McCain. What was the price of oil in the summer of 2008? Taking you back in time. That's the price of a gallon. But how much was the price of how much was oil? It was well over 100. Can anyone tell me how much it went to in July of 2008?
145.
Very close. Excellent. It was a high of 147.
I missed.
You missed, but you were very close. So A+ for you. You got it. Yeah. So it went to a high of 147. So think about, remember, what was Biden and McCain? What were their platforms? It was very interesting.
Obama and McCain.
Well, so you had the Palin drill baby drill, which surprisingly enough ended up actually happening. Kind of happening, not because she said to drill baby drill, but the United States ended up drilling a lot after 2008. But you basically had two very similar energy platforms from both McCain and Obama, because the price of oil was really high. There was concern about peak supply. So there was concern that the world was running out of oil, that there was not going to be enough oil to meet global demand. So that was part of this, Arjun Murti, if you follow him, this super spike, right? That we were moving towards a super spike period because there wasn't enough supply to meet demand. Remember, from the price of a gallon, 147 for a barrel. And so you had, in 2008, you had both candidates really pushing renewable energy, that the United States had to move off of oil, because we were a big importer. So it was very costly for the United States to continually be buying imported oil. And And then after 2008, you had, of course, you had the financial crisis. And then you had a lot of, what did you have? You had also a lot of cheap money that started going, that started kind of flowing through the system. And that really helped to fuel, helped to fund the shale oil boom that ultimately sort of has really dramatically changed the landscape, the energy landscape for the United States. Ed Morse, who's at Citigroup, he wrote in 2012, move over OPEC, here comes North America, that North America with the United States, with Canada, if Mexico had kind of gone in the direction that many people had hoped in terms of reform and having to kind of have more of an opportunity to sort of increase its production, that together, like all three countries in total could be producing about 20 million barrels of oil a day, kind of in some ways sort of shifting the power balance away from OPEC to North America. We don't see 20 million barrels a day coming out of North America today, but the United States definitely, and you can see even going back to 2015. I'm just going to ask you one more question because I think this is also really interesting as kind of a moment that sort of changed a dynamic. When you think of where kind of the title of tonight's talk is on relationships, 2015, what was kind of a big international event or an international agreement in 2015?
Paris Peace Accord. The Paris Climate Accord, 2015.
Yeah, Paris, that's true. Okay, so we're going to come back to that. That's very interesting. Yes. I wasn't thinking of that, but that's also really important. Now you're coming up with lots of other things.
Sanctions on Russia, right?
Well,
can include oil.
Yeah, so 24, okay, so you're bringing, now I'm going to connect all of these dots. I'm going to connect all of these dots. So in 2014, you have Russia annexing Crimea. That was also kind of a very interesting moment for Russia and China. So Russia and China have had somewhat of a, not always the friendliest relationship. But 2014 was quite significant because in 2014, that is when China signed the Power of Siberia pipeline deal with Russia. And it was in spring of 2014. It was in March of 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. And by May of 2014, a massive contract was signed between Russia and China to build the Power of Siberia pipeline. And the Power of Siberia pipeline was built almost in record time. But what ended up happening in 2014, which is really interesting, was that China got an extraordinary deal from Russia because Russia realized that it was kind of losing some of its foothold in the West. And so anyhow, China ended up getting a very good deal in 2014 to build the Power of Siberia, to build this Power of Siberia pipeline. In 2015, though, which the issue that I was thinking about was the JCPOA. Okay, so this was the United States saying we're going to kind of like, we're going to look at kind of rapprochement with Iran. Could you have imagined that happening before 2008? Now, why? Why? If you think of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, what was the U.S.-Saudi? It's not what is the U.S.-Saudi relationship. What was the U.S.-Saudi relationship for decades?
Still bad.
Yes.
The Bush family was supported the Saudi.
Since the end of World War II, the United States has been supportive of Saudi Arabia, but it was a kind of what was called an oil for security relationship. That Saudi would provide oil, the United States would provide security, and that was a kind of a relationship, even through, wasn't always flat. Sometimes it had some really significant, really low points, the Arab oil embargo of 1973, but you still had a commitment on the part of the United States to provide security to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia was kind of the linchpin of the Middle East and a linchpin for the global economy and access to oil. But once the United States became and Saudi Aramco, once the United States had a lot of oil and was less reliant, then the United States could sort of rethink relationships and rethink its relationship with Iran. So that was quite a significant. And now, what is the U.S.-Saudi relationship? How would you define the U.S.-Saudi relationship today?
Very scratchy.
Scratching. Yeah, it's, you have a prime minister who is the prime minister, Mohammed bin Salman. He was Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, but now he's prime minister, and soon probably eventually will be king. And MBS, as he's referred to, doesn't need the United States anymore, and also recognizes that can't count on the United States. So to kind of like bring it all together, I think it's also really important when we're thinking about, what is the outlook for hydrocarbons? What is the outlook for oil and gas? And I think this year has been a kind of a wake-up call, right, for the world. This is the year that probably we have heard the term energy security most widely used, right? You see it in terms of, you're just reading the newspaper, if you're reading The Economist, you're reading the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. Energy security has kind of catapulted into sort of the front page. If you go back to February of 2022, there was a real question mark as to how would Europe survive? Like, would Europe get through the winter, not just the winter of the remaining months of 2022, but what would Europe look like through the winter of 22 and 23? We are about 3 weeks away from what is called the end of the heating season in Europe. So it's March 31st, it's kind of the cutoff. How has Europe fared over the last year?
Very well.
Yeah, it's fared pretty well, and for a couple of different reasons. It's been a relatively warmer winter than winters past, so it's been unseasonably warm, which has meant there hasn't been as much demand for heating. You've had great energy efficiencies. You have the European Union putting in kind of demand mitigation actions. And what else? You have
You've had NGL.
Yeah, you've had LNG.
LNG transferred, instead of going to the Far East, going to Europe.
Which is also very interesting, because this is, so we have, the Armada, I think some of the articles that maybe you've read is the LNG Armada that has kind of went in, was kind of rescued Europe, that it was kind of came to Europe's rescue, I think is the term that was used in an article recently, but it came to Europe's rescue, but it also meant that it didn't go other places. So just in the last 6 months, about 20 liquefied natural gas contracts have been signed between US companies and European companies. Okay, so not an insignificant amount. As I pointed out earlier, Germany is, again, if you sort of play with counterfactuals, it would have been hard to have imagined in December of 2021, that Germany would have up to 6 liquefaction terminals, FSRUs, that they would have offshore and 2 terminals onshore. And that's what they will eventually have. It would have been, no one would have thought that possible, right? You had the Nord Stream pipeline that was already running. You had Nord Stream 2 built. This was not an idea. as a friend of mine who works on pipelines, he's like, we have lots of ideas for pipelines, but until you get the steel in the ground and you don't have a pipeline. Nord Stream 2 was a pipeline. It was built, it was ready to go. And then after the invasion, like Germany was pretty much forced to say, we're not going to.
Wasn't it also sabotage? Wasn't it also sabotage?
That's Nord Stream 1. And news came out today, again, to be determined. The news did come out today that it was a pro-Ukraine group. Again, I think we'll be following that news, but Reuters published today that it was a pro-Ukraine group. That's that could be very problematic for many reasons. And I'm happy to sort of talk through why this could be very problematic. But yes, so you have lost Nord Stream 1. So I think there's something very interesting that has transpired is, Europe has had to dramatically reduce its reliance on Russian gas. And much of that gas was pipeline gas that came through Nord Stream 1, that came through other pipelines that fed into Europe. Europe still gets liquefied natural gas from Russia. Where does it come from? It comes from the Russian Arctic. Okay, it doesn't get a lot, but it does get some. But a lot of liquefied natural gas that has come from the United States, a lot of gas that has come down from Norway, gas that has come up from Algeria. So Europe has sort of had to sort of rethink where it gets its gas supply. And it's also, and this I think is very interesting in light of what you said about Paris and climate, is there's a sense that this has sort of thrust Europe into a faster transition, that it will, it's going to make the energy transition away from dependence on gas to renewable energy, which Europe already has some very progressive policies and targets, but that is even going to sort of force it to happen faster. So when we think about the energy transition, kind of a transition from one into sort of another set of energies, that the sense of deep energy security that Europe has experienced. And again, if you go to the summer, not today, but if you look at summer prices for gas, super, super high in Europe. And so European governments have spent hundreds of billions of dollars subsidizing, right? Subsidizing industries, subsidizing households, so that households would not experience the pain of exorbitantly high energy prices. Germany has seen a lot of shutdown. I mean, I think we're going to see the ramifications and the repercussions for years in terms of how it's hit the German economy, which has heavy manufacturing, right? And you go down to the south of Germany, that's where you have Germany's heavy industry. You've seen companies that have, laid off, companies that are saying, we're going to relocate because we can't afford the high energy prices that we are now paying. So I think Europe is a fascinating case. I should add, though, that, and this is where it gets, I think, when we're talking about, supply chains and geopolitics of oil and gas. So as the world has really focused a lot of attention on Europe and making sure that Europe sort of maintains energy security, other parts of the world have become very energy insecure. Okay, so if you're Pakistan, for example, and you don't have a long-term contract, they didn't, for liquefied natural gas, they basically couldn't afford to buy LNG over this past year. So something that's very interesting for a case like Pakistan or Bangladesh, Bangladesh, both have been hit really, really hard by high LNG prices. And one of the things about LNG markets is you don't have it's not a market. You have a North America, like kind of a North American market, a European market, and an Asian market. Prices are different. Pakistan has said, just recently announced, their plan was to transition away from coal to gas. What did they recently announce? They said, no, we're going to double down on coal. We have domestic coal. It's cheaper. It's more reliable. It provides security. We have security of supply, and we're not going to be dependent on volatile gas markets. And again, most of their gas that they were getting was imported liquefied natural gas. So that's the case of Pakistan. You saw the government of Sri Lanka fall, right, over the summer. It wasn't just due to high energy prices, but high energy prices was definitely in the mix to create very significant political instability, because when you have people whose livelihoods depend on getting access to petrol, getting access to being able to fill up their cars because and when they can't, and when there's an absence of supply, you had massive political upheaval in Sri Lanka. So I think it's very interesting that we kind of look at Europe as having survived a really difficult year under conditions of significant question, right? Could Europe withstand a year where they didn't have as much access to Russian gas as they had become dependent on? But then we see consequences that go way beyond Europe that I think are super interesting. And I'll just maybe give a couple of highlights, and then I want to make sure we get time for questions. And I know I've taken you on in many different directions. One of the things that I find super striking is about these sort of policy reversals. And so this kind of will answer the question about the role of hydrocarbons and thinking about climate and energy transition. So I gave you the example of Germany. So what did Germany decide after 2011, after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the disaster in Japan? Closing all of their nuclear. Okay, so Germany under Merkel, it had been long-standing. Fukushima was kind of the trigger. There was already public opposition to nuclear, and that Fukushima that was it. It was like the nail on that coffin to say no more nuclear. What has happened in the last year? They extended. Again, you could not have imagined in 2021 if you had said to the German government, you're going to have nuclear power open beyond the end of 2022, they would have been like, 100%, we are committed. We're not backtracking. Germany ended up reversing, and now they will keep 3 nuclear power plants opened until the end of April 2023, potentially beyond that. France, which had, and this kind of answers some of the nuclear questions, France in 2015 said that they were going to reduce their nuclear power by 50%. So plants that were planned or scheduled for retirement, they were going to let those plants retire. What has France said in the last year? We're going to continue, and we're going to build more. What did Sweden say over the summer? Sweden is building new nuclear power. So countries that had, and what is Japan doing? It's very interesting. I was talking to my students about this today. So Japan, in its green transformation plan, nuclear is a very, very important part. So the plan is to reopen all of the nuclear power plants that closed down after Fukushima. Right now, there are 10 open, with 30 to be open, and the government's plan is to reopen all. Now, there's not complete public acceptance of this, but here's I think kind of a really interesting question. So there's not majority support for the reopening of nuclear power, but there is overwhelming public support for enhancing energy security. And so enter that idea of how do you bring domestic energy security, where when you're dependent, and Japan is very dependent on imported hydrocarbons. If you're a country that's very dependent on imported hydrocarbons, you don't want to be so susceptible to all the volatility, especially when the price is high. So Japan is saying, listen, this is capital we've already invested. If we don't reopen, those are stranded assets that we can't use. So Japan, it's a real pretty dramatic reversal, which is also, I think, interesting. And this also predates Russia's invasion of Ukraine in last year. Even in the EU, okay, in the European Union, in 2022, they came out with what they called the EU taxonomy. And the EU taxonomy includes both natural gas and nuclear. And it includes both natural gas and nuclear as green. Okay, that's the EU green taxonomy. So emphasis on green. Germany was opposed to the inclusion of nuclear. Because again, remember, this came out in January of 2022. Germany had in its head that we're done with nuclear. So Germany was deeply opposed to the inclusion of nuclear, it being part of the green taxonomy. France was like, well, 70% of our energy, of our electricity comes from nuclear. We need to have it. It's zero carbon emitting. We're going to have nuclear as part of that mix. Germany said, well, we use gas, so natural gas has to be part of that mix. So that's how you got both nuclear and natural gas as part of the EU's green taxonomy, which is kind of interesting now that we're kind of a year plus later, where we see that, natural gas has been, imported natural gas from kind of replacing Russian gas, but also this kind of resurgence of nuclear renaissance of sorts. And on the question on the issue of nuclear, I would say that the United States has dramatically fallen behind. The United States has the most nuclear power reactors in the world. However, we're not building new nuclear reactors, and China plans to build 48 new nuclear reactors. So, and they've built 10 in the last 9 years. Okay, so these are newer nuclear reactors. So most of the nuclear reactors that we have are 40 plus years old. So they're coming close to being, retirement. Some of them will be extended, but we find ourselves really caught in regulatory hurdles. The construction to build a new nuclear power plant is very expensive and pretty significant public opposition. I think it's depending on where you are. I'm going to answer the question, and then I'm going to make sure that I try to answer all the questions that were asked. So my take on hydrocarbons, my take on oil is it's not peaking yet. So meaning that we're not seeing peak demand. So I think it will continue to go higher. Partially it'll continue to go higher not because of North America and not because of Europe. Demand, we kind of don't matter when you're thinking about demand. I mean, we still of course matter, but you're not seeing any dramatic increases in demand coming out of North America or Europe. The demand picture is Asia and Africa. So when you're thinking about increasing demand for hydrocarbons, a lot of that is going to be in Asia. It's going to be China. It's going to be India. You still have about 300 million people in India who are in what is referred to as energy poverty. So, and you also have, there are approximately 1.3 billion cars on the road as countries that are still sort of emerging economies, but that are building up a middle income population. There's a question whether or not there will be an EV market that will be able to sort of meet their automobile demands, or whether or not, you know, that first car will be an internal combustion engine car. And then in the United States, the average period of time that people hold a car is about 10 years. So you sort of think about, you know, the replacement side. So I would say that probably oil, we see peak after 2030. But there is an interesting question, though, which I think is, Bob McNally, who's the president of Rapidan Group, he thinks peak demand happens after 2030. His fear is that we're going to be, because of peak supply, we are going to find ourselves in a really sort of very, very, very tight market because we're not making a lot of investments in new hydrocarbon production. So when you're looking at, if you're seeing that today we need 100 million barrels a day, and maybe if you think next year, 102, 103, where are those extra barrels going to come from? The United States can increase a little bit, but we're not investing a lot in new production. A lot of countries are sort of pulling back, retreating from investments in hydrocarbons, mostly coming because of the banks don't want to invest in oil and gas for ESG reasons. So really the countries that will, you know, that can increase production are, you know, Saudi Arabia. You've got a handful of countries that have the capacity to increase production.
Russia have bandwidth?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Russia has some bandwidth to increase production. So this is kind of an interesting question, though. So how does the world think of Russian oil and Russian gas after this is all over? So when you think about sort of post-invasion or post-war, does sort of Europe say kind of like, oh, well, that was then, this is now? A lot of people would say, no, these pipelines are done. So Nord Stream 1 was sabotaged, Nord Stream 2, does it ever become operational again? Does Europe ever see the same dependence that it had pre-22 after the war? Probably not, but with oil, I think it is different. So Russia can increase, but only not by that much. And part of it is it's stifled by, again, you won't have sort of Western money going into Russia to help sort of revive its old infrastructure. And so when you're thinking about new production out of Russia, a lot of that would have to come from what are referred to as green fields. So who's going to provide the funding for that production? Again, maybe it's China. You know, I mean, China has been a buyer at the low end of the Russian market, as has India. So some countries are buying discounted oil from Russia because it's significantly cheaper than Brent or, you know, that's on the market. So I see oil demand continuing to remain pretty strong. And I'm always reminded when I go to airports. Airports are kind of like my dose of reality. It's not just airports, or when I take a road trip and I see how many cars, and I'm kind of looking around, I'm like counting how many EVs there are on the road. But airports always, and again, aviation fuels, you know, it's significant, but like over 200,000 flights take off every single day across the world. It's about 220,000 flights. So like and you think about, you know, more people as incomes increase, they want to travel. You know, this YOLA, right? It's you only live once. If you want, you know, you want to take these trips. We saw after COVID, this, you know, revenge tourism really sort of, you know, I want to get back on the road. I want to get back in the air, even with inflation, I'm going to pay the higher price. So that's the part that I'm sort of struck by. But if you look at, if I had the North American economist for BP, so British Petroleum, their take is pre-2030. They see it around 2027, 2028, where we'll have peak demand. But 10 other people, Arjun Murti, Bob McNally, they would say it's post-2030. Gas is an interesting question. I think gas is here for a while. One, it's lower carbon than coal. I think in the United States, natural gas has, depending on where in the country you are, it provides kind of, we pay relatively low prices for our natural gas. We're also exporting a lot of what we can liquefy. So even with China, we've signed, I don't know, I think we probably have signed about 10 long-term contracts with China. Now, this is interesting, and then I want to make sure that I'm quiet here and I take more questions. Or if I didn't answer your question, let me know. This was pointed out earlier today, that this is the story of energy in the United States is not this, we sometimes use like the United States. It's really not the United States. When you're talking about Saudi Arabia, you're talking about a national oil company. When you're talking about the United States, you're talking about, these are private companies. These are private companies. And so the guy from Potent today, he was like, this is a story where like, these were companies that were like, okay, we're gonna get that tanker, we're gonna get it to Europe. We're gonna make sure we have extra tankers, and some of that was diverted, right? And again, you have like the what ifs. What if China had not still been under COVID lockdowns? If China was fully open all of last year and into the fall, the picture could have been very different, because some of the LNG that was meant to go to China got rerouted to Europe, because China's demand for LNG went down because the country was still under a pretty significant lockdown. China has said, this was just in the fall, around the 5th five-year plan, that China is not that they're going to take all of the LNG that they have contracted. This is not going to be rerouted LNG. This is going to be LNG that stays in China, used in China. They've also, kind of an interesting response to energy transition that China has said that they are not going to shut down or end, this is specifically in reference to coal, any source of energy until they feel very secure that there will not be disruptions with the new. So meaning they will think about reducing certain forms of energy like coal, but they're not going to move towards dramatic replacement until they feel that their system is secure enough, because they don't want to find themselves energy insecure. So as China looks at 5% growth over the next year, they want to make sure that they have as much energy as they need. So China's system is about 60–65% coal. We're not looking at any sort of sharp reduction in coal consumption over the next year to 2 years. And China has said that they're going to continue to rely on coal. They'll be building, so they'll be building more solar and more wind, quite significant numbers actually when you look at gigawatts, but they're going to keep the coal. They're going to keep the coal because again, domestic energy security is kind of paramount. And this is, I think, maybe to the answer. It's not that what was committed in Paris in 2015 no longer matters, but I think what 2022, and here we are in 2023, is that how do you balance those commitments to address climate change and its impacts with making sure that you have energy security and making sure that you don't have these disruptions, because these disruptions are also have massive costs to economies and of course to individuals. So which questions did I not answer?
Oh, this is a new question.
Okay, it's a new question.
Well, on the consumption side, we've got natural decline. What do the many people you have access to what is their range for natural decline worldwide?
You mean in terms of production?
What % natural decline occurs every year?
In on the sites of the wells, like where you produce.
Production.
Mm-hmm.
Because is it 5%? Is it 2%? Is it 8%? I think it might be in the 4 or 5%.
Depends on where you are in the world.
I'm asking worldwide. I'm asking.
Yeah, but it depends because like shale has.
Oh, that's.
Shale's a little bit different. Shale's a little bit different. Shale has a higher like decrease point, whereas Saudi is different. So Saudi, at least in terms of the transparency that you can find, that it's Saudi still has capacity to go higher. So you're not seeing. That's a question mark. So Saudi has said that they could in the event of a shortage, right? Let's say there was an attack, right? And the world lost 2 million barrels a day for a month, 2 months, 3 months. And there was going to be a country that could fill in that supply. Saudi has said that it could be, like, that is the country that could do it, because they could go up to 13, maybe 13 and a half. I think there's an interesting question now for how long. I think that's, so Halima Croft, who's at RBC, she has said that they have the capacity to go higher, but there's a question as to for how long they could sustain that. So I think that's where, so you do see natural decline. And some, you know, by the way, some of that natural decline is not natural. Some of it is because you don't have investments in infrastructure. So Mexico being a case in point, Mexico has more production capacity than they're currently seeing. It's because they haven't invested in the infrastructure. So there's a lot of inefficiencies. You have above ground risk, you have below ground risk. So some of it is natural decline and some of it is just kind of forced decline because there aren't the investments in the infrastructure in there. And they've made production very challenging because of politics. A lot of politics have gotten involved in Mexican oil and gas production.
But what I'm saying is your 5% figure or 2% growth figure, we have to add to that a figure
around decline. So that kind of gets into the point that I was making, that, you know, it's not even just about where peak demand is, but where peak supply might be, where we might find ourselves not able. Demand, there's going to be a continual uptick in demand, but we're going to get to a place maybe sooner rather than later because of the last 5 years, you've seen underinvestment in new supply. So what is going to be the consequences of that underinvestment in new supply? And I think we have yet to sort of see or fully like understand what that might look like in the next few years. Again, if we're thinking that if you take the position that demand is going to increase, then you kind of, unless you want a super spike, you're going to have supply going up with that demand. And so that's where the question mark is in terms of where that new supply or that extra supply is going to come from without more investment. So you had President Biden at the last State of the Union. What did President Biden say? Which is kind of a reversal, talking about policy reversals. What did he say? Well, he said, right? He said, we're going to need more production. We're going to need more oil and gas. We're going to need more oil and gas production, which again, very different than what was the story in 2020 when it was about transitioning away from oil and gas. Just kind of this kind of think about. So, but also one thing that I think is really, really important, and I didn't talk about it, but this could be a whole like 2-hour, 3-hour lecture, is you have some very interesting what are called like green industrial policies that are underway. So here over the summer, the United States passed like historic legislation with the Inflation Reduction Act, $379 billion, right? This is about this is also, that's a competitive legislation to say that the United States needs to catch up, or in the national security strategy of 2022, outcompete China. It's very specific in the national security strategy that the United States needs to outcompete with China. Climate change was mentioned 64 times in the national security strategy. So I think the United States is kind of in a position that maybe one of the best positions, and this is kind of what I wrote in Barron's, is that we have the hydrocarbons, and we're making, you know, really big investments in, you know, clean energy technologies and innovation. So if you go across the 7 national labs in the United States, it's quite like, it's incredible what's happening in the research and development side. Europe has a massive green stimulus plan, Japan as well. So you see this kind of competitive sort of competition also in the renewable energy space. And, you know, the EU was very critical of the IRA because they see it as protectionist. They see it as favoring US production. And it's going to take European companies, and they're going to want to come to the United States and not stay in Europe. But Europe also has some pretty generous programs in place around sort of stimulating the clean, what's called clean economy. So what's referred to as green industrialization. So this green industrialization, clean energy industrialization happening here in the United States, happening in Europe, happening in places like Japan, where there's a lot of and already happening in China. So China, if you think of it as a foreign policy instrument, China is the largest manufacturer of solar panels, the largest manufacturer of wind turbines, the largest manufacturer in terms of per capita EVs, the number of EVs that they're producing. And they are, if you didn't have China's solar panels, you wouldn't have as much solar being used in the world today because they made it very cheap. And so that allowed for more affordable deployment.
Yes, so a lot of the companies, the diversified energy oil companies, they learned how to squeak a profit out when oil was at $25, $30 a barrel. So now at $80, $100 a barrel, they're having pretty big margins. So
understatement.
In your perspective, from the professionals you deal with, are the each dollar can be allocated towards research and development, or how are they allocating those dollars? Because I'm hearing a lot about like carbon capture, or just maybe finding more areas for new production.
I think all of the above, honestly. Like, I think, so depending on which company you're looking at, but if you're looking at like BP, for example, Exxon would be different, but BP has had like a launch fund where they have investments that they do, and they also have investments in sort of smaller companies that are working in the renewable venture, that are working in the renewable space. However, BP itself also kind of recently retreated, right? And because they've announced that, the reality is, if you're BP, if you're Exxon, Total's a little bit different in Europe, but a lot of companies, Shell, their bread and butter, the bulk of their money that's coming in is coming in through hydrocarbons, right? And they're still not yet, seeing high levels of growth in terms of revenues coming in via some of these other ventures. So, BP and Bernard Looney recently said that, listen, it's a tough thing to say, but the reality is that the world still needs hydrocarbons. So we need to continue to invest in hydrocarbons. So they had announced that they were going to start to kind of, not to divest, but start to retreat a little bit. And now they've said,
it's a zero-sum game. Every dollar that's invested in some future opportunity that's opaque, is a dollar that's not invested in creating energy that can be more immediate.
Yeah, so that's where it gets super interesting and tough, right? Because you know, if to address, right, what we need in terms of the energy transition and the energies we need as we move forward, we need those investments. And that's part of what, you know, is behind the IRA. And I met with someone yesterday from the DOE who's part of the loan program who works under Jigar Shah. So if you look at Jigar Shah, he's kind of responsible for a lot of the money that will, you know, that's being being sort of decided upon for the, but part of it is just, it's very hard to build. It's really hard. It's not as if we don't have the capacity to have a lot more renewable technologies in the United States. You need transmission lines, you know, you need to get through regulatory hurdles, you need to build. We have a lot of NIMBYism in the United States. We also have what's referred to as bananas. A friend of mine who writes for The Economist called it bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere, nowhere. Like, you know, it's because it's kind of like, it's really hard to have anything built. So when you want to build a transmission line, we need lots of new transmission lines as we electrify more, but getting those built. So as much as we can build lots of new wind and solar, but the grid, you need to be able to balance the grid. You need to be able to have those transmission lines from the point with which that wind and solar is getting produced and moving it. So that's where it gets really complicated. And I think that's where the United States has some very significant challenges. In China, you want to build something, it gets built, but that's just the reality. And the same thing in India, if you want to build something, it's like the United States, it's really hard. So where you have these targets, we're getting into sort of the political and the, you know, the regulatory challenges. There's a lot of money that's out there that's ready to be deployed, but you need to have, so I'm in New York. New York is meant to have 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. Yep, 9 gigawatts, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So how much of it has been built? That's where we get into the challenge. So it's supposed to be by 2024. Now we're looking at, someone told me last week, somewhat in like, his take is 2030. So again, off by about 5 years. And much of it is because, you know, if you're building offshore wind, you need to build transmission lines. If you go out to East Hampton and you say, I'm going to build a transmission line, it's going to go through this beach, people are going to be like, no, I'm sorry, go to the next beach. So they're finding it very challenging to find like the best places for the transmission line. So there's a lot. You also have rules like the Jones Act in terms of ships. You have ports. Has anyone seen like the new wind turbines? Like larger, taller than the Eiffel Tower. They're massive. So if you think about, and now you need, this is where it gets super interesting. Now you need US crew. So on those ships. So it would make sense to have the Danes, the people from Denmark who do offshore wind really well, to come over with their ships. And they're very technically adept at offshore wind, or Norway, but to build here, you need to have US workers on the ship. So anyhow, it gets super complicated.
Out in California, east of LA, they have lots and lots of wind turbines, right? And not only do they kill thousands and thousands of birds, but they kill hundreds of thousands of raptors. So, but they get a permit for that. So if you shoot an eagle, you go to jail. But if a wind turbine kills 100 of them, it's okay.
It's a tough question to answer, or it's a question, a comment. It's more of a comment. I think it's a comment.
So where's the economists? We need energy versus we're killing the birds, people. You know, where's that going to get adjudicated?
So so again, because we live in the United States, and you know, if we probably did a political comparison between New Jersey and New York, we'd find policies that look different between our two states. If you look at California and you look at New Jersey, also differences, and they've had so California has been sort of way out there in terms of build, like new energy build to replace fossils. fossil fuel. So you also have bans on new natural gas hookups in California. You know, the whole idea of the no natural gas stoves and ovens, that kind of started in California. Yeah, no, that gets tough. So if you want to follow someone who covers this issue in great detail, is Robert Bryce. So Robert Bryce, he was with the Manhattan Institute. He has a great Substack, but he actually, again, his position, just so full disclosure, his position, and he makes it very clear, he's an end-to-end guy. He's a natural gas to nuclear guy. He said that's his, like, that's what he sees as an ideal power system. You have natural gas, the United States has a lot of it, and then you transition for lower carbon to nuclear. He's not a wind supporter. And one of the reasons why he's not a wind supporter, and this is again in all of his writings, is about birds. He's like, you know, we don't do enough. And he keeps a database of rejected projects. And so right now his database is almost 300 rejected projects across the United States. So this is where there was, you know, a kind of a proposal to build out wind, and those got rejected in towns. But there's a lot of controversy also over some of those rejections. Some people say that that is lobbying from the fossil fuel industry, that they're lobbying and they're kind of creating this opposition movement through rejecting new renewable energy build, whether it be solar or natural or wind. So I think you should read it, but also understand that there's a whole other side that says, hey, wait a second, there's a whole other story behind those rejected proposals that have to do with the natural gas industry lobbying and sort of, you know, kind of pushing communities to say no to new projects.
Back to geopolitics, you talked quite a bit about the Europeans and Asia, how they suffer through this, and look at the charts, the number one supply of oil gas in the United States. So how did the United States benefit from this the last year in terms of export, price change?
How did the United States benefit?
Yes.
Oh, I would say that, you know, we didn't see a dramatic uptick in our energy prices. We did see an uptick in gasoline prices over the summer, but that kind of quickly came down. And now, so this was kind of pointed out today, like if you're Cheniere, right, which is an LNG company, they've had extraordinary year.
Yeah, but the tax goes to the U.S. government.
Yeah, I think that, again, that's one of the reasons why I don't see the United States sort of retreating from oil and gas production, because there are returns that come back to the U.S. economy, whether it be through jobs, it be through taxes, it be through, kind of a different kind of hard power, right? So this was this, Majed today, he said, very interesting, you can kind of debate whether or not the sanctions have been effective. Have the sanctions been effective? Have they altered Russian behavior, actions in its war against Ukraine? Has it hit its economy? Yes, absolutely. But when you look at the role of LNG displacing Russian gas, potentially forever, like you may never go back to a pre-February 2022 picture so you will never have Europe buying as much gas as it did prior to the war. And part of that has been, again, if you take certain people's views, LNG, like it's been a force that came to Europe's rescue and in some ways has damaged the Russian economy, not just now, but way into the future. That Russia is no longer going to be able to sort of like have the same markets to the West as it did. That it's, the markets will be to the East, but all those pipelines that go west, you know, so you have significant losses there. So I would say that, I mean, the US from a foreign policy perspective, from a, I think, yeah, has probably fared better than other countries because of oil and gas. But other people could disagree.
Yeah, this is kind of a global question, council of despair, but many people studying climate said it's too late. So renewables are never going to save us. We're too dependent on oil. We haven't even, the peak, as you said, China's more and more cars in China. India's floating with cars all over Asia. Unless there's some new technology for removing carbon from the atmosphere, we're going to be over this.
We already are.
Oh, we already are. So it's.
I have a.
So the coal from 1% to 10% for 60 years for that to happen. Petroleum from 1% to 10% to 40 years make that to happen. So we're not the solar wind, not anywhere near.
That's what he's saying. That's, yeah, I think that's the argument that you're kind of making, that, yeah. So again, I think there's a very big conference going on this week in Houston, Texas. It's CERA Week. You'll probably see it if you read the Wall Street Journal. There are usually a couple of stories about it. One of the big themes is kind of, if you go back to remember clean coal. So this is like decarbonized oil and gas. So you even have the United States basically saying we want to become the lowest carbon exporter of LNG. So we want to reduce the carbon from the production. We want to capture it. If you know, direct air capture, right? Taking, you know, carbon out of the atmosphere, then you've got, you know, carbon capture, capturing it at the point of production, putting it into the ground. So yeah, I think it's expensive. Where are you going to put the carbon? Similar to the NIMBYism, where do you store carbon, and where do you store it safely? And so you have places out west that have been identified as carbon storage areas. It gets really difficult. So Norway has a lot. Norway's doing a lot of interesting things. Canada is doing some interesting things on the carbon capture sequestration front.
There might be
I was reading a report just this week, to your point, and yours as well, that the situation almost is, and it maybe is too far gone, but there are a handful of technologies that maybe have a chance, you know, and really tip of the spear innovations. And the reward is so big that if one of them gets there, we'll call them bird shots. Like if one of them gets there, a couple of them get there, the reward could be so big. So there is a massive amount of capital following that. So, you know, at that point,
yeah, Larry Fink said that the next 1,000 unicorns are going to be carbon tech companies, you know, companies that are really working to reduce carbon, you know, and I think there's this idea of that ingenuity. And so Mike Weber, who's at the UT, yeah, so Mike Weber, who's at the University of Texas, Austin, he has a great book called Power Trip. He also has a PBS series by the same name. I really recommend it. It's very well done. I brought him into class over Zoom last spring, and actually, no, in the fall. And he's like, you know, here's the thing, in the United States, we know there's a problem. And he's like, then there's one day they're like, it's a problem. And then we really get on it. And so I think, you know, and his argument was that, you know, we're kind of seeing that IRA, we're seeing there's a lot of really dynamic companies, a lot of ingenuity, a lot of innovation that we see happening. So, you know, this is what he says to his students is that's why he remains very optimistic, even knowing that, you know, we're seeing the impacts of climate, we're going to continue to see the impacts of climate. And one of the big challenges is that, you know, the carbon that we've emitted that's already up there is it's there, right? So anything that we're going to do is not for, we're not going to, any massive changes that we make in the next 10 years is not going to mean that we're not going to see the impacts of climate change, but it's more like 20, 30 years that we hope to sort of reduce what will be the impacts. So I think, but there's, what I tell my students is to remain optimistic, because like I worked with a company last summer, it's called Air Company. They started in an incubator at NYU and they convert carbon to alcohol. So they were converting carbon to vodka. Good parties. They would always host really good parties, martini parties, right? But now what they've done is in the fall, they announced a big contract that they signed with JetBlue for sustainable aviation fuel. So now, so they started with vodka, but now they are doing sustainable aviation fuel. So, again, that's an example. But yeah, so I think this is, it's really, it's a tough one, because I'm thinking of, I think his name is Ted Nordhaus, William Nordhaus. He's with the Breakthrough Institute, and he's written some things in Foreign Affairs and in, there's one who got the Nobel Prize, and then there's another one, but both work in energy, last name Nordhaus. But he's written some very interesting things, though, about economic growth, and that countries that grow are also have the ability to be more resilient to climate impacts, because they can build stronger infrastructure. So as we see the impacts of climate change, the countries that you see fewer dramatic damages are the countries that are sort of more economically advanced. Now, then you get into this conundrum, though. How do they grow? And if they're going to grow with hydrocarbons, which is how we grew, right? We grew with lots of coal. It's cheap and efficient, but that's going to be exacerbating climate change. So it's a tough challenge. So it's really hard. You've all been wonderful. Any final questions? Because I know I've kept you over time.
I would say we have about 5 or 10 minutes more, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's good. I just have to get the 9 o'clock train. I got to get a 9 o'clock train. Any other?
Just wanted one quick question. What do you think about the gas finds out of Israel? This is supposed to be like a major find, one of the largest gas fields ever. And I'm thinking, there's so much, and then you see about all these other elephant fields that are out there. So I think the supply issue is not a concern.
So you already see that gas is, it's an interesting.
It's enormous. I don't know how
it's pretty significant. It's pretty. What's also interesting is that from Israel's perspective, it's also provided opportunities to have cooperation with countries that normally would not, right? So trade with Lebanon and Jordan and things like that. So it's kind of interesting that, the same thing with, we went back to the US Saudi story, right? Like energy can be a really interesting source of cooperation. I mean, that was the idea between, Germany looking at Russia saying, well, this trade will provide stability. This trade will kind of push Russia to play by the market, right? It will want to be part of the market, that it's not going to be a bad actor, because this energy trade will kind of keep that relationship. So I think for Israel, I think very interesting when you look at what's happening in the East Mediterranean region. I was in Greece last March, and a lot of questions about the East Mediterranean pipeline, because the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline was to take some of that gas that was produced out of Israel and kind of move it, via pipeline, seabed pipeline, and go up into Greece. It ultimately didn't get built, partially because the United States said no, because due to climate change. And that this was in January of 2022, though. So also important to sort of identify. Now it's being revived as an idea, but it's technically very complicated. What you'll see is liquefied natural gas, and Egypt and Israel kind of sort of some of that gas from Israel going to Egypt, and then Egypt hosting the liquefaction plant, and then that being imported then being exported into Europe and beyond. So I think that gas is being produced and will be kind of part of that mix. But I think it's very interesting region, and interesting for points of cooperation in a region that you haven't seen lots of cooperation amongst the countries.
How do countries compete fairly? One country is basically taxing its energy production for climate change and stuff, and other countries like India and China are definitely not. So their cost of production is going to be significantly lower. How do countries then compete economically if basically they're going to be judged, they're going to be taxing their energy production 20–25% differently? Germany's having this problem now.
So like Norway has Europe has a very high carbon tax, right? So Norwegian oil production is taxed, but Norway has this, they do it very, I think the Norwegians do it really well. So they're able to produce at a higher price per barrel, but still end up being extraordinarily profitable.
They got 1 million people. So,
a little of 5.
But it's not
right, but Saudi Arabia, but you also have different costs of production. So like U.S. shale is not high cost production, but it's more expensive than Saudi production. Saudi production is one of the cheapest on the planet. So Saudi is able to produce per barrel, just production, not talking about the amount that the budget needs. So there's a difference in terms of what the government needs, but just the production is much cheaper than most other parts of the world. So you have like the cost of production, there's a lot of differentiation. But you have, so in Europe, right, if you travel to Europe and you're renting a car and you're filling up your car and you're like, why am I paying like $5 a liter, €5 a liter? Because that's all on the tax, that's the taxes. So, but why is that there? Because part of that is to incentivize demand reduction. So Europeans pay a higher tax on their energy, especially their hydrocarbon energy, in order to reduce demand.
But it's hurting their business.
So this is, I think, where you're getting into this very interesting tension around the debate, which has very much been highlighted this year. So if you want to sort of get into like a really interesting debate, and this, again, I'm not taking a position, but this is what like you'll read in the literature, that did Europe go too far in terms of its policies to reduce hydrocarbons from the mix and making it very difficult, and then found itself like somewhat vulnerable, very sensitive to energy insecurity. And so this, I think, this is why you're like, this question mark is, are we seeing this sort of less emphasis on climate and more emphasis on security? Like, how do you balance climate change and energy security? And I think that's kind of where we are now. And this is the conversations that are happening all this week in Houston. This is conversations that are kind of like, I think you heard it out of Biden's speech just a couple of weeks ago. How do you balance, again, emphasis on climate, but by the way, please continue to drill. Please continue to produce oil and gas, because look, our gas is helping to support Europe. Our gas is, it provides security at home and abroad. Like, that's kind of the narrative that we see. So yeah, I don't think it's an either or. Yes, I have to go. Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you. It's fun. Yeah,
yeah, it is. And right, and stakes are high.
Coming.